there. Welcome to our live tutorial, Authoring Clear and Compliant Oil and Gas Specifications. We have a few things that we're going to cover today, so I'll give you a quick overview. First, we're going to show you how to automate requirements review across different teams and projects. We'll also use QScribe, our requirements authoring tool, to generate configurable, actionable reports to share them across teams. And also, we'll look at how to ensure that your requirements are clear, concise, and level appropriate for the type of document that you're writing and the stage, and making sure it fits within your workflow at the stage that you're currently writing. So you can request, send me an email at the bottom there, james.carr@qracorp.com. I will make these slides available if you'd like to have a PDF copy of these slides. In that, you'll have links to all of these different links that you see on the screen there. You'll be able to view a recording of this tutorial, download a QScribe PDF, as well as the PDF of our oil and gas essential requirements guide and checklist. So if you'd like to get a copy of that, just send me an email, james.carr@qracorp.com, and I'll make sure that a link is sent to you as soon as it's available. As soon as the recording is available, we'll send those out either later today, or if you're tuning in from the other side of the pond, you'd be most likely getting that tomorrow. Okay, so we'll get started here. So for oil and gas, the requirements that I see come in are a lot different than the requirements that we see from other industries. And there's a few things just from conversations that I've had with folks that are authoring specifications and requirements for this industry that are very, very unique. And being in this industry all of the time, maybe some of you have come over from different industries, maybe some of you have always worked in oil and gas, but there are some unique challenges that are faced in authoring requirements for this particular industry. And the first is that the requirements themselves need to fit into a complex and highly connected supply chain. So you're well aware of that, just how many different ways a project can go wrong because there's so many different parties involved. But it might be hard from the perspective where you're sitting to see just how different that is from other industries. So if I compare that with, say, medical device development, there are subcontractors, there is a supply chain that's involved in producing that, but the actual product itself is really very secretive. You know, it's all about trade secrets, and as you're developing your product, you want to get it to market as fast as possible, but everything is happening within this closed circuit of your company and the partners that you're working with. So as a result, you have more direct communication with the other parties that are involved. And it's also less likely to be confrontational in the way that you approach your requirements. So if you're writing requirements, a lot of the time for medical device development, the folks that are actually writing the requirements are the ones that are reviewing them and ultimately are engineering the products that come out of those. Whereas I know that's not the case for here in oil and gas. You have to write your specifications, realizing that the other people that are reading it might not only misinterpret what you're saying, but in some cases, they could actually use what you've written to challenge maybe the way that a contract was awarded, or their scope of work of what's actually required to meet that requirement. So it's not just a matter of making sure that your requirement is understandable, but actually it needs to be defendable. So you can actually look back to that and say, no, without a doubt, this is exactly what this means. And that's a unique challenge for oil and gas, where your requirements are going through so many different teams and different people. That complexity is a real challenge that sets your challenges apart from other industries that you're working on. So another key part is that the work is never done. You're not going through a specific phase with your project and then you've launched your new product. For the most part, you're actually working with ongoing projects. So if you want to make a change, it's much more difficult to say, okay, starting with this next product that we're developing, we're going to start doing it this way instead of that way. Now there are throughout the supply chain, there are different manufacturers and different companies that are supplying services and products to serve the oil and gas industry. But overall, those big ongoing projects that you have, the changes that you're going to be making to a process or a procedure need to happen in line. So there's this transition period where you can't afford to have things shut down while you bring in a new approach. And then lastly, you have moving regulatory targets. So everything is always up for change, and you need to be planning things years in advance. So always being aware of how the regulations can change and how your landscape of what you're proposing to do might have to be adaptable and shift as you go along is a really unique challenge that's faced in the oil and gas market. So the results of that are a few. One, monumental accomplishments have been done in the oil and gas industry in terms of innovation and new technology. the way the scale of projects that have been developed over the last 150 years or so as this industry has grown, and that's resulted in a traditionally low return on investment in digitization. So there's already these big working processes that we've seen that we talked about there earlier. The work is never being done, so you're building upon a process upon a process. But what I've observed from comparing notes from the requirements and the way that the interactions happen between the oil and gas companies versus other industries that we've worked with is that really the need to innovate the actual process of doing these large projects that you're working on has not been counteracted by the benefits that would be generated. And we'll talk about that a little bit more soon. But the result of these challenges is that now we have in this industry a very conservative approach to change. You've accomplished these amazing, huge projects, very profitable overall. And so when you're looking at, okay, here's a new way of doing things, you don't want to upset the good thing that you've got going in terms of process. So we do know that some things have changed with that over the last little while. And the oil price collapse of recent years, we know that has not recovered. And what we have here is an article from Wood Mackenzie. They say global upstream spend is up from lows of 2016 and 17, having collapsed from a 2014 peak of $750 billion, but not by much. We think that the spend will recover to over 500 billion US by 2020, driven by the US lower 48, a flurry of deep water projects, and a new phase of LNG development investment. So it is a sluggish recovery, geographically very patchy, and it's a very long way from being called a boom. So what we would say from my observation and what this article is saying is that, and later on in the article, he mentions that the super majors and the majors are now learning to do more with less. So the revenues are coming back in, but the price of oil is still low. And the result is that hasn't made its way through the entire supply chain yet. So we're sort of in this weird place where the hardest part of the collapse has been recovered from, but it's sort of like the calm after the storm, where now we're looking at, okay, how can we make sure that doesn't happen again? And the image that I have there of the guy throwing the bucket of money, that's not meant to be an insult. And I actually wouldn't say it unless I had heard it from multiple people in this industry, that the old way of doing things was, throw enough money at the problem and it goes away. We can look after it by sending more resources, sending more money. At the end of the day, we're going to make so much off this project anyway that, if this costs a little bit more than it could have, then that's really not a big deal. Whereas now, in this stage of being at the calm end after the storm, these processes are being looked at again and say, okay, with these amazing, huge projects that we're building and these aggressive kind of timelines that we have for how we want to develop and build our industry, what are the setbacks that are possibly going to get in the way of keeping us from getting there? And it means efficiencies at every level. I know that many of you have lost coworkers over the last half decade because of the downturn and all of the layoffs, and people had to move and find new jobs and open new roles, and it's been a huge challenge. And so now on the other side of it, what can we do to improve those processes so that we avoid that type of problem? And one thing that's come out of that is this talk of digitization. So we want to start using the latest technology. We want to mainstream our documentation processes. We want to bring everybody together so that we're on the same page and not wasting time reinventing the wheel and going through that. So you've seen that with some standardization initiatives from the IOGP, like the GIP 33 initiative to standardize those documents. And we've also seen from individual companies, from the super majors right on down, that the focus is on digitization and, okay, what's this going to look like for us? How can we actually leverage this technology? And this quote that we have here from an article from EY says, sustained low oil prices are driving adoption of digitization across the oil and gas industry. So that reality now of having to do more with less has resulted in looking to digitization and really modernizing these processes that you have. But it's actually ramping up the stakes for cybersecurity as well. So our Global Information Security Survey, that's from EY, revealed that 57% of respondents in the oil and gas industry have had a recent and significant cybersecurity incident. So traditionally speaking, if I go back to the previous slide there, this conservative approach to change that mindset of if it ain't broke, don't fix it, actually has served the industry well. It makes sense to be conservative about new technologies. It makes sense to be skeptical when you look at a new technology of, okay, what will this actually deliver and what are the risks that it represents? And that's actually a very good thing. So I hope that as you see our presentation today and our product, that you're equally skeptical of what we're claiming to offer, but you can also look at how it could potentially benefit and weigh those two things against each other. So if you were to represent it visually, you basically, as you're looking at these available technologies, there's a very low tolerance for risk. You have safety critical projects, you have downtime is extraordinarily expensive for any of these projects that you're working on. So you can't afford to take on the risk of completely changing a process overnight or by putting unproven processes into your existing workflow. You have this really complex web of interactions, and your supply chain is so finely tuned, I guess, to work the way that it's working. A disruption to that can be catastrophic. So what we want to look for is opportunities where technology can help us gain the highest reward with the lowest amount of risk. And we believe that our approach to requirement authoring actually meets that need, that we've actually taken the risk out of the equation so that this can be implemented to augment the people that you already have working on these documents, the gatekeepers, if you will, of your documents that are a part of every company that I've talked to in oil and gas has the people that are responsible for making sure what you've written is clear and concise and is going to be understood by everyone who picks up that document down the line. So if we can help you focus on what's going to offer the highest reward with the lowest risk, that's what we want to do today. So the product that we're going to be talking about is called QScribe. It's a requirements authoring tool that provides analysis and feedback as someone is actually writing their requirements. It's giving them live information on how they can improve the clarity and quality by enforcing a number of standards. So the INCOSE guide for writing requirements is a key to that, but also your own company standards. So the professionals that you have working in these roles of controlling your documents, making sure that your team understands how these things can affect other companies down the supply chain and how it can throw a project off the rails if everyone's not on the same page and if we don't understand what it is that we're reading. So we want to empower those people to understand their projects that they're working on, continue to author the framework of these documents, and then solve problems as they come up. So that expertise that your team brings to the table in terms of being able to review a document and make sure that it fits with all of the regulatory standards that you need to follow. It needs to fit, if you're not at the highest level in the supply chain, that it makes sense with the specifications that you need to follow for the companies that you're working with. If you are at that highest level, they need to be looking at all the different ways that somebody could misinterpret that as it goes through the supply chain. And so in the way that we've designed QScribe, it's designed to apply the principles of best practices for requirement writing, to clarify the content of what's been written and help identify problems. So when we talk about using natural language processing, about using AI, the technology is not going in and making changes to these documents for you so that you need to babysit the tool and make sure that it's not changing things unexpectedly, but it's giving feedback to your professionals that are working on these documents so that they're aware of how something could be misunderstood as you go through. So I'll step back for a quick personal story here. I didn't want to gross anybody out. So that is, don't worry, that is a plastic fly in the picture. There's a fly in the soup. Now, in my own story, the fly didn't end up in a bowl of soup. It ended up in a bowl of cereal. And there's a long story that gets to that. So I'm going to keep it as short as possible. So it actually started with a barbecue. So I was having a barbecue and we made hamburgers and it had started to rain. So I quickly got the burgers off and I had some that I was saving for leftovers. I just left them in the barbecue, closed it, went inside. We had our meal. It was delicious. Really good cheeseburgers. Highly recommend the barbecue cheeseburgers. They're pretty tasty. So anyway, we did that and I forgot about them. So these barbecue burgers were left outside. I covered the barbecue. I didn't even think about it again because I usually bring them in right away. But a few days went by and then we went to use the barbecue again and I saw that these patties had been just kind of sitting in the barbecue for a while. I was like, oh man, okay, I got to get rid of those. So now the work that I could have done in the first place and actually had leftovers to eat was now going to be more work because now I had to still take them off the grill and throw them in the garbage. But the problem now is that they were unusable. So too bad, that's a waste. So I brought them inside. Here in Nova Scotia, Canada, we have very sophisticated, I guess, composting program. So we can just put all of our compost out to the street and they come and pick it up. But we have a little bin in the kitchen. So I took these burgers and brought them inside and put them in the green bin. Never thought about it again. So then a few days later, we went to take that outside. And when I lifted it up, I noticed, don't mean to gross anybody out here, but there were some maggots in the bottom of the green bin. So that was kind of gross, and they weren't just there, it was under our sink. So there were a few of them around. So I was like, oh man, more headaches. So I got to go back and do more work again. I've got to clean up all of these, kill the maggots and get rid of them. Not a big deal. And then I started finding them in kind of some weird places, and you know, it's under the mat, and I'm like, oh man. So I go through more work of cleaning those up. So we get that all taken care of. And then several days later, now these little baby flies start to appear. And it turns out I didn't get all of the maggots when I was going through. So now my house has these flies flying around. I've got to go through the process of killing the flies, and it just keeps growing, and it becomes a huge problem. So ultimately, this results in me having breakfast one day, and lo and behold, I look down and one of the flies comes down and lands in my soup. And it's actually cereal. And I had no idea when I made the decision to leave those burgers on the grill that it was going to result in all of these problems down the road. So if you were to step back, first I made the mistake of not bringing them in. Secondly, I realized it, made the quick fix, threw them in the garbage. Later, there was the deeper realization that there was a larger problem here because I had brought these in, and now they had the maggots that started to grow. Gross. All this additional work and rework, and then the unintended consequence here was that there's a fly in my cereal. What does this have to do with anything that we've talked about so far? If we carry this back to how this might work in a oil and gas specification, you write a vague requirement. So maybe you're using, saying that something should be done easily. This should be done in a way that's, this document on the wall should be easy to read, or you have a problem of not understanding what exactly it means. You can have a quick fix where once you realize that this is a problem, you go in and ask for clarification. You say, okay, what does this requirement mean? Oh, okay, now I understand. Boom, move on to the next stage. But what you don't realize is that maybe other people who are reading that same document have a different interpretation than what you clarified. So then you get into disputes around who is actually responsible for this. You're asking for dispensations about going through and doing it a different way. You have to go back and redo the work. And then there's additional work on top of that because the project has already been developed under this false misunderstanding. And then since your projects are ongoing, there's always this unidentified risk that at some point that document that you wrote maybe months ago, maybe years ago, is going to crop back up and somebody is going to have a dispute around something that was written a long time ago. So that's that level of unidentified risk that exists when your requirements are not clearly defined. So the way that QScribe can help at each of these levels, now these are anecdotal, these are quotes that I've heard from, some of them are from resources that we have, others are from conversations that I've had from users. But if we go to the requirement writing level, we have folks from Ultra Electronics that use QScribe, and they've written a case study in partnership with us. And one of the quotes from the engineers there says, we have requirements on requirement writing, but QScribe is faster. So at the level of actually writing the requirement, you can spend less time writing them and get better results by using a tool like QScribe. For clarification, we have another company that's using this to write the requirements, and they've actually found that the final review times that it takes when they get everybody together and approve the final document have been cut from taking a week to go through and clarify everything to now being done in a day, because using QScribe, they've improved the quality before it gets to that point. In terms of minimizing disputes, we were at a conference where actually I was talking about the Ultra Electronics case study, and the person I was talking with said, you know what, we actually just finished a project with Ultra Electronics. And I was like, oh yeah, well, how did it go? And they said, I did notice that working with them was really easy. It was the specifications were clearly defined. We were on the same page, and yeah, it worked out really great. In terms of rework, in one of our case studies, they talk about being able to catch errors before they can propagate into later stages of development. And so it saves you at that level. And then this level of risk. So de-risking your procurement process from the beginning by taking those steps to make sure everybody's on the same page. So when we're talking about this problem of vague requirements or unclear requirements, it's not just at one specific level where people are feeling the pain. People that are writing these documents are having challenges because they're dealing with inputs coming in from all these different sources. And it's just a challenge to keep all these rules in mind, but often you have multiple different people from different teams all contributing to the same document. And that's where it becomes really challenging to keep everybody on the same page. And then through each stage as you go along, the benefits of cleaning up your requirements process actually continue to grow, especially in a complex industry like oil and gas. So if we bring that back around, this is actually a really common problem. This isn't something that's, this part of it isn't something that's unique to oil and gas, but it is, the risks are higher in oil and gas. So it's a very common problem. Nearly 10% of all project cost increases are due to poor requirements. Nearly 50% of projects fail to meet their goal due to poor requirements. And this is the big one. More than half of all engineering errors actually originate in the requirements. So if you have teams that are working on a particular project or a new product that they're developing and the requirements are not clear, the chances are you're not going to get exactly what you asked for because you haven't clearly defined what it is that you need. So it's also an expensive problem. This, I think, almost goes without saying. If you've decided to join this call, you're probably well aware of these problems that can come from poorly written requirements, including delays in procurement, project cost increases, you end up buying the wrong product, your pricing has to be inflated to reflect the risk that you have in there. There is that undiscovered risk that could crop up at any time. And a big one that I've seen in speaking with folks in oil and gas specifically is that amount of wasted time. So it's those phone calls back and forth. It's somebody reading through a document and trying to figure out exactly what it is that they're asking for or what I need to do to comply with this at each level. And as those get escalated, it can really slow things down and you're spending a lot of time, a lot of project time wasted on simply clarifying something that could have been clearly presented in the first place. So the cost of implementing these corrections grows exponentially as you go through later stages of the process. And this is especially magnified in oil and gas because these projects are ongoing. So you always have the risk of one of these problems cropping up later on because the same documents are used and reused over and over as you go along. So when we talk about common requirements errors, here are some things that I see most often. So the one at the top is grayed out because that is actually if the subject matter expert is mistaken about something. So maybe they're applying an old standard, they didn't know about something that had changed and they just end up putting the wrong information in. Well, if your subject matter expert is getting the information wrong, there's not much that can be done. But if they're spending less time looking at all of these other issues that we're going to talk about, they're actually able to spend more time making sure that those things that actually require their expertise and their knowledge, you're more likely to find those types of errors that do require their expertise to be able to find them. So the other common errors that we see are requirements that are not clear. So something that could be misunderstood by a reader. So you could look at that as A and B. So, okay, if I read the sentence this way, it means I need to do this, but if I read it that way, I also see that it might be asking for this. I'm not really sure which that is. Now, if you're being not specific enough, so the second one down, there's room for interpretation there. So maybe you've just made it so vague that you've opened up the door that, well, maybe somebody could say, yeah, I've met this requirement because I did this, but really you were expecting something different. So if you're not clearly specifying what it is that you want, you can't expect that you'll get exactly what you want from the other side. Another common problem that we see is the inconsistent use of names or units. So if there's a particular actor in the system, whether it be a system, a subsystem or a component or a user or a company, if you're using those names inconsistently, maybe merging different documents together, it makes the document really hard to read because when you're reading and you see something used by a different name, you're thinking, okay, is this a new player? Is this somebody that I haven't seen yet? Or is this actually the same person that we've been referring to elsewhere? And also the inconsistent use of units. So different systems of units, perhaps you're using a metric system and combined with feet and inches and other parts of the document. So those inconsistencies can cause confusion and can actually lead to calculations being incorrect and all sorts of other problems. So the last one that we typically run into is contradictions with other requirements. So to differentiate what we offer from QRA compared with other solutions that are out there that help with requirements is that no matter where you're writing your requirement and what tool you're using to manage them and approve them and sort them and connect them with each other, at the end of the day, when you start writing a requirement, you're writing it in a box. So at some point when you're writing, okay, I need to communicate this, I'm using natural language to do it. I have my box in front of me and I have my keyboard. So what am I going to write there? Maybe you're using Excel. Using Excel, same thing. At the end of the day, you're going to have a box there, and it's going to be you and the keyboard in that box. And you need to decide what you're going to write there. And you need to write it in a way that's going to be clearly understood by everyone that's reading it. Maybe you're using an advanced system like Doors NG for managing your requirements. Still you in the box, and you got to write something there. Using Polarian, which has gained a lot of traction recently in oil and gas. So a lot of companies describe that they're sort of making the move towards a tool like Polarian, but they're still, have one foot in the Word and Excel world and are trying to gradually move teams over. If you're using a tool like that to manage and approve and get all the benefits that you have from using a modern tool like Polarian, you still have that box and you still have to type something in there on your keyboard. So lastly, maybe you're using JAMA. Same thing applies. You're going to write your requirement in that box. It's you and the keyboard. And if you're writing with natural language, you need to decide how you're going to write that requirement. And that's where we help. We don't manage requirements. We're not involved in the approval process or connecting requirements. We're actually focused on what you choose to write in that box. And we believe that it's a really important part of your requirements process. So we do that in a couple of different ways. So out of those 4 issues that we looked at on the previous screen, 2 of them are covered by our quality analyzer, which I'll show you in a moment. So that deals with requirements that are not clear. So that's the possibility that it could be misunderstood by a reader or not specific, where you've just opened the door that there's room for misinterpretation and you may not get exactly what you asked for. And then at the document level, we have consistency and similarity. So if there's that inconsistent use of names or units, we have a check that can help your professionals as they're reviewing these documents. It can help them to identify those types of issues. And lastly is our similarity analysis, which finds similar requirements that seem to be talking about the same things so that you can check to make sure that they don't contradict with other requirements, but also that they're not repeating what's already been stated elsewhere. So basically the quality analysis is for the individual requirement itself. The consistency and similarity is for the entire document. So again, we want to leave the task of understanding the project and authoring that framework and solving problems as they come up in the hands of your professionals. Again, the gatekeepers that you have in the oil and gas industry, every company that I've met has some sort of team or group that's responsible for reviewing those and making sure that your industry standards and your company standards are being followed. But QScribe can help by applying those principles, clarifying that content, and really duplicating the expertise that these people have so that they can extend it to everyone who's involved in writing requirements across your team. So that's the area that we want to help in. The actual words themselves that you choose to use in writing your requirements are tremendously important in making sure that you get your message across. So that's where we want to help. The current version of QScribe runs within Word and Excel. So we interface with those different management tools that you have. We have features built in to integrate directly with Doors. That would be Doors Legacy and Doors NG. And so through a CSV export, you can export your requirements, get a QScribe analysis on it, make your changes, and then replace them within Doors. Similar workflow for those that are using Polarian or JAMA or other management tools. We actually are in the process of developing QScribe version 3, which is going to integrate directly with these tools. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later as well. But basically, when you're looking at your process now, if you're using Word and Excel, we integrate with those directly right now. If you are starting to make the shift towards a management tool, we will be on that journey with you because we see the benefit of keeping everybody within the same workflow. So try as we're going through the demonstration here to focus on the actual results of what you're seeing, and then we can work with you to make sure that the authoring tool that you choose to use or your management tool that you choose to use for your requirements will work well long-term with these new processes that you're developing as well. So everybody has to address these problems of vague language and ambiguity and inconsistent requirements. So how have they been addressed traditionally? The most common response that we have for this industry is guides, rule sets, and checklists. And then you have individual people that are responsible for actually making sure that these rules are being followed. So QRA has produced guides like this. We have our 21 tips for requirements engineering. We have our oil and gas guide and other resources that can help people with checklists and guides and keeping up to date on what the best practices are for requirement writing. There's a variety of different approaches and systems that you can use that help people write requirements clearly from the beginning. And the most popular of those is the NCOSI Guide for Writing Requirements. It's the most well-known and most widely used. So if we look at this just for a second, the NCOSI organization has developed a number of different set lists and characteristics and checklists. So if we just look at one of those right now, look at the rules for requirement statements, there are currently 40 of them that they've published on that list. I did a live tutorial earlier this year in June on how to automate the NCOSI Guide for Writing Requirements. That's more focused on how exactly QScribe works with those standards and those rules. So if you would like a copy of these slides, I can make sure you get a copy of that link as well. So you can check that out as we go along. But back to the NCOSI Guide for Writing Requirements. 40 rules, if I put them in really short form, it might look something like this. So it would be pretty simple. So you have a checklist like this and you say, okay, we're just going to teach everybody in the company who writes requirements to follow these rules. So it's 40 rules. We can study them. We can learn the best practices for requirement writing. Maybe we'll bring in an expert trainer that can teach us the best practices for requirement writing, and we'll just get everybody on the same page. One of the problems that comes from this approach is that each of these rules actually are quite complex, because it's not just a matter of, okay, I'm not going to use vague language, for example, in my requirements, because along with that vague language rule comes a list of words that could be potentially vague. So this is actually taken straight from our configuration for QScribe, and you can't just memorize the 40 rules. You have to also memorize all of the words that could potentially violate those rules. So now you've taken a task that you think, okay, maybe a couple of days at a training session will get everybody on the same page, but you actually have this larger problem of, okay, we don't know how we're going to go about teaching all of these different engineers who are already overworked and already have a lot on their plate to memorize all of these different rules, plus all of the words that can trigger these problems. And so how do you approach it? Maybe you set it up like a game of Jeopardy and you get everybody together and you say, okay, I'll take vague words for 600 and try to remember it. Like, it's just too much. You can't possibly go through that whole process of memorizing all of these things. And then as changes are being made, everybody has to memorize, okay, we're using this word instead of that word now. And okay, for this type of project, we're using it this way versus that way. It's just too much to memorize. And that's actually where the original need for QScribe came from. It's just too difficult to teach large teams to write consistent requirements and keep everybody on the same page. So when you look at those different options, so using guides and rule sets, following those rules and company standards while writing is a challenge, just to keep those rules in mind. And then manually reviewing against these rules is a tedious and time-consuming task, but it needs to be done. So what's happening today, from what I've seen in companies that I've spoken with, is when a specification is updated or a requirement is written, that's submitted to some sort of technical practices team that would review that document, make sure that it's following all of those rules. I've heard numbers as high as 500 rules that these people are checking for as they go through to make sure that certain words aren't being used, that the proper rules are being used, that the requirements are concise enough. And this is just a very tedious, repetitive process to go through every time a change is made. So the alternative to that is actually finding a balance where you can use some of today's technology to reduce the amount of time that's spent doing these monotonous, repetitive tasks. And there's a nice quote from the NCOSI Guide for Writing Requirements that says, "A time-saving tool should not take more time to maintain than it saves." And we think that's really important. So when we approached QScribe, again, back to the same image that we saw earlier, it was really important for us to look at how technology today, natural language processing technology, can actually be used in a way that's going to augment the professional. It's not like a academic event for us to just see what the technology is capable of doing. We really wanted to start with what are the pain points that people are experiencing, what are the challenges that people have in writing requirements, and how can we bring a tool that can help people get everybody on the same page and be unified in that. How does it actually work? I will show you the current version, like I mentioned earlier. I'll show you the current version within Microsoft Word. We have another version for Excel. The only difference between the two is really how the requirements are imported and selected. So you'll see that some parts are highlighted here in orange, others are in blue. That's because the parts that are marked in orange are identified as their own term, but aren't actually requirements. So they're excluded from the analysis. The things that you see that are highlighted in blue are marked requirements that will show up over here on the right-hand side. So when QScribe is installed on a user's computer, when they open Word or Excel, they get a QScribe tab here at the top. It works just like the other tools within Excel and Word. So as I'm going through here, I can still make changes to my document. I can change formatting. Everything is still open and available to me. And then when I go to that QScribe ribbon, then I get the extra tools that are suitable for QScribe. So you'll notice at the start of this document that we have some definitions. And included in that, we say the word shall indicates a requirement, the word should indicates a recommendation, and the word may indicates a permitted option. So according to this document, every requirement should contain one of those three words and only one instance of each of those three words. So if I go into my QScribe configuration here, that's this button up here at the top, I can actually specify to the tool that the imperative statements, so words or phrases that command something must be done, are actually, these are the three suitable options for this document. I can use shall, I can use should, and I can use may. And these are pretty standard. So should is optional language. So in the default configuration of QScribe, this is actually listed under our optional escape clauses. So for the sake of this document, where that actually is an acceptable word to use because it's clearly defined that it means a recommendation, I've removed it from this list, and it actually still shows up on this list of example words. So if I remove a word from a list, it's still available to me to go back and add it in later. But if I look over here under imperatives, I now have shall, should, and may. So this is how you can customize your library according to the different definitions that, to the different types of projects that you're working on. So if you have a large team, you know, one of your large corporations that you're working with, you're going to have different divisions and different teams that are working on different types of documents and different levels of requirements. This is where you can specify and make sure that the feedback that you're getting is relevant to the document that you're dealing with. So this might be this would be where you'd impact the, you know, change the imperative statements. It's also looking for negative imperatives by default. Vague language that you have listed here, you could add or remove words from that list. So this is where you can enforce your own company standards. So you want to give this access to this part for your actual technical practices team or your requirements review team, so that they can go in and set the standard for how your company is to be writing requirements. And then you can have access to choose from these different configurations available to anybody who's possibly writing requirements or will be editing requirements throughout the company. So another version of the tool, I'm using QScribe for individuals right now, so I have access to go and make these changes myself. If you're using our enterprise solution, QScribe for Teams, you can actually give access to specific users so that only those with administrative privileges can go in and make changes to these configurations. But then your regular users would be able to choose which configuration they want to use from this dropdown. So you would have a specific configuration that one team is using for one project. You might have a different one for a different initiative or a different project or a regulatory document that you're dealing with. This can be customized in a number of different ways to give you the most valuable feedback for what your team is working on. So some ways that QScribe is being used today, it is being used by the IOGP on the JIP 33 standardization process. Companies like Shell and E&I are using it across the company as the requirements best practices. So it's not just the requirements team that are reviewing and editing the documents, but actually anybody at the company can access that when they're working on a document, so that they're automatically following those rules that the requirements teams have set up for their company. So it's really important for us to make it so when you first get QScribe, you can start getting results right away. So the setup process is done in a very short amount of time. If you're using QScribe for Teams, we'll work with your IT team to get the server side of it set up to get that going. But in terms of actually getting in and working with your configurations, you'll get live feedback on that right away. So as soon as you enter it in, you don't have to spend weeks or months going in and customizing this to fit your company. You're going to get feedback right away. And then as time goes on, you can update these configurations and save new configurations to work more specifically for the particular projects that you're working for. So here's the document itself. On the left-hand side, we have QScribe open on the right. So when I go in, I'm looking at all of my requirements now for this document, and you'll see that they range in scores between 1 and 5. And those represent the risk level that the errors that have been found represent. So I can sort this according to score. If I want to look at the ones with the lowest score first, I can do that, or the ones with the highest. or I can sort it by the way that they appear in the document. So we'll look at it that way, and I can actually filter this by issue as well. So these are based on the INCOSE standards for writing requirements. So if I wanted to look at, say, for example, we set up those imperatives. So I wanted to look at each requirement that included multiple imperatives. I'll see that there's 4. I'll look at this one as an example here. So the fact that shall is present twice in this requirement means one of 2 things. I'm either trying to say too much in this requirement, and this should be split into multiple requirements, or it could also mean that just the way that I've worded it is just unnecessarily wordy. So I can make this more concise. So if I read this one, I click on that issue of multiple imperatives, it'll show me the word shall is present twice, and it says for the ground resistance test, the resistance between equipment and ground point on skid shall be nominally 1 ohm or less and shall be no more than 5 ohms. So really that is a range. So I could go in and adjust this to say between 1 ohm and 5 ohms. You could break that into separate requirements, but that's actually solving 2 problems here because we also had excessive continuances in this. And if I hover over that, you'll see that that says replace alternative terminology with a specific choice. If necessary, replace a single requirement with multiple condition-based requirements. So in this case, we had and repeated multiple times here, just by the way it was worded. We've got that now down to just 2 instances, which is acceptable according to the standard QScribe configuration. So now that I've made those changes to this requirement, I can reanalyze this requirement. And now it's going to update that with a new score. So I can go here and I see that this one is now out here. Now scores a score of 3 out of 5. So let's look at what the issue is. It still contains cross-referencing pronouns. So if I select that, we'll go back up here. We'll see that the score has been improved to 3 out of 5, and I can make that other change to get the score to 5 out of 5. So you're able to make those changes as you go. That's the issue of multiple imperatives. If we look at vague language, it will show every time that a vague word has appeared in the document. If I look up here at the top, we'll select this one as an example here. So piping systems shall be checked for stresses caused by pressure, weight of pipe, equipment vibration, weight effects of piping components and fluids, external loadings, such as, and then they're listed. So they have the same issue with the previous one. The multiple excessive continuance here is here. So those are combinator words. So words like and, or would be included on that. So by adding multiple combinator words, it makes it so it's not clear exactly what it is that you're asking for. And then we'll also see that contained within this, we have the vague word located as such as. So if I hover over this, it will give me feedback on this as well. Restate the requirement with vague words as one or more requirements with clear and definite intent. So in this case, they're actually giving more information to say, okay, what do we mean by external loadings? We mean things such as wind load, seismic load, settlement, frost heave. So all of those things are listed. But what's important to note is anytime you use vague language, so in this case, the word such as, you're implying that there are more things that could be included on this list, but you've chosen not to include. So as long as you recognize that when you're writing this, including this list actually doesn't add any value to the requirement itself because it's not testable. If you're saying these things are possible things that you could include, you could add that as a comment. And this particular document does have a number of comments that are included as well. But by breaking that out and saying, here are some examples of things that you're looking for, but not making it part of the requirement itself, makes it so the requirement is more direct and to the point as you're going through. So saying such as, giving examples without listing explicitly all of the things that you expect to be included on that list is really a waste of space on the page. It just makes the document harder to read because you're not actually specifying all of the conditions that are required. So another one that comes up for that is the word etc. a lot. So that's something to be aware of. If you are giving things for the sake of just giving suggestions so they know what you're talking about, it's best to put that in a comment rather than keeping it in the requirement itself. So again, you can make those changes and update that as you go. Take another example here. The manual with all relevant details to install, commission, and operate/maintain equipment shall be provided with all applicable drawings and details. So now I'll get into what we have here as the quality score and quality warnings. So over here on the right-hand side, we have a little triangle here that's indicating a quality warning. These don't impact the score. So it's actually possible to have a 5 out of 5 score and have a quality warning because depending on the context and how it's being used, this may or may not be a problem. So if I look at the universal quantifiers as an example here, the word all is being used. So, and I'm using the word all, any, every, I'm opening up the door to really expand the scope beyond what I actually mean in this case. And a lot of the times that word, it just ends up being a throwaway word. You've thrown it in, it doesn't actually add any value to what you're saying. So that's the first problem. And then going up here to what actually did affect the score is the use of these vague words. So the first one is the word relevant. So if I select it here, it shows me in context where that word was used. And I can hover over it and get that feedback to say what needs to be done with that. But you'll see here, the manual with all relevant details to install and commission operate the machine. Recognize that when you're using vague language like this, it's not actually adding any value. So if I were to remove the word relevant, and even the word all in this case, manual with details to install and commission, the meaning did not get any more clear by adding that word relevant, because the word might mean something to you different than it means to the person who's picking it up and reading it down the line. So you're just opening up the door for confusion and for possible misinterpretation, because what they might consider to be acceptable for what is relevant and what you have in mind when you write that could be completely different things. So by bringing those types of words to your attention, it's really easy to write them, because in English class, we learn that you need to be writing in a creative way and making it interesting to read and using different words. But at the end of the day, a lot of these words that would be acceptable for many, many forms of writing, almost any other form of writing, just aren't acceptable for requirement specification, because you're trying to get down to the point of exactly what is required without any other information in there that's not necessary. So by adding these extra words, it kind of props up your statement and makes it maybe flow a little bit better, but it's actually taking away from the overall meaning. So that's how our quality analysis helps. And if you see a word coming up here that is acceptable maybe in your industry or for the particular project that you're working on, you can go back and remove that from the configuration. Or if you're maybe somebody reviewing it at another level, you can make the request for that to be changed in the configuration as well. So over time, this will evolve to not become just the standards for what's acceptable for writing good requirements, but actually your own company standards become embedded into this ongoing glossary of QScribe. So that's looking at the document level or the requirement level. If we look at the document as a whole, we're going to check for consistency and similarity. So I'm reanalyzing the document because I've made some changes to it here. And so under consistency and similarity, we're looking at the document as a whole. So when I click view analysis here, it's now been updated because of the changes that I made. The first that we see is a list of terms that are used in this document. So this is something that takes somebody reviewing a document many, many hours to go through, and it needs to be completely redone anytime that a change is made to the document. So this is actually making a glossary for you of all the terms that are used. You'll notice that some of them are single words, many of them are multiple words. For example, the natural language processing can pick up that stainless steel is its own term. As we scroll down a little bit further, site philosophy being recognized as its own term, hydrostatic testing as its own term. So you can quickly look through this and see the way that these terms are used throughout the document. So if I wanted to make sure that every time I talk about the principle that I'm using that consistently, I can click on it here and actually see in context the way that it's being used and quickly verify that I'm not referring to anything else by the word principle, and that each time I use that, it is being used consistently. And you can go through the list and make sure that it's being used consistently throughout. It'll also check for units automatically. So it automatically pulls these out. This is customizable as well in the configuration tab here. So this is where you can customize this for your own team. You can go in and go to unit consistency here. You can add your own abbreviations. You can modify the configuration that's here by default. That's specific, there might be specific terminology or specific units that are used for your industry. You can add those and change them as needed. But one important thing here is that you can actually filter them according to what's consistent and inconsistent with the International System of Units. So if I wanted to look, for example, at all the time that inches is being used in this document, I can just scroll through this list and quickly check that each time that inch is being used, the metric equivalent in millimeters or centimeters is being included along with it. So I can quickly scan through and just make sure at a really quick level that no requirement that's maybe been added from another source is erroneously just using inches and not including the metric equivalent, and that can save a lot of problems down the road as well. So the last one we'll look at here within the tool itself is similarity. So right now I have this slider that goes between 50 and 100% set to the max here at 100. So this shows me that I don't have any two requirements that are exactly the same in the document, which generally speaking is a good thing. You don't want to have the exact same thing written twice. But if I do bring this threshold down a little bit, you'll see that I do have some that are very, very similar to each other. So what I want to do here is make sure that in context, both of these requirements are actually necessary since they are included in the same specification. So if I click on this one, for example, we'll see that these two are actually identical, except for the word "the" is inserted in one of them. So one is talking about testing the electrical works, and the other is like a general overview of electrical best practices. So you would say, okay, if this is already covered under the general overview of what's required, do I need to repeat it? Maybe yes, maybe not. But by bringing that to your attention, it allows you to quickly make that determination. And you can see here how errors can quickly slip in when things are being copied and pasted over. So there's two that are very similar. If I bring this down a little bit further, I can choose another example here, maybe this one. And it will show me highlighted in red everything that's the same, and highlighted in green what's different. So I can quickly look at what's different between these requirements and determine if there is a conflict or if everything's okay. So if I look here, one's talking about NEMA 4X enclosures for wet and outdoor areas. The other is talking about NEMA 12 enclosures for dry and indoor areas. Perfect. So depending on the size of the document, you might want to spend more or less time or lower this threshold to review the most similar requirements. But by being able to automatically see, even if they're hundreds of pages apart in your specification, being able to see two requirements that are talking about the same thing side by side gives you the best chance at catching those types of errors where you're duplicating yourself or possibly contradicting what's been written elsewhere. So the similarity analysis is the best way to check out those types of differences. So I briefly mentioned QScribe for Teams. So we have QScribe for Teams offers concurrent licensing. So it just comes down to how many active users you have at any time instead of buying a license for everybody who might end up using it at some point. And we have custom analysis configurations that are shared automatically across your network. User management happens on your end through the QScribe server application. So you have full control over who has access to it. EARS templates, so the easy approach to requirement syntax, are built in. And it is completely secure offline. So we can share our security lifecycle development document with you if you'd like to review how we keep your information secure. But basically, we keep it secure by leaving it on your servers or on your premises. We don't take any information back to run this analysis. It all happens on site, and it runs completely on your own network. So we'd be happy to share that information with you as well. So running a little low on time here, so I will jump right into the questions. Trevor, do we have any questions so far? I'll start with one that we actually got before the tutorial started. I got an email with somebody asking about they're writing requirements that are going to be adopted by other folks later on. So the question was, they had repeated in their document the phrase "unless otherwise specified" or "unless agreed or approved by the purchaser," etc., language like that. So when something is a set requirement, but they do have the option of going in and actually making that change to that requirement before it's fully published. I think personally the best way to approach that would be to write the requirement as it currently exists and add a note underneath that saying, very specifically, instead of just saying "unless otherwise specified," saying who or what has the authority to make that change, and then saying, if the supplier proposes another way and that's approved, then this change can be submitted. But I would avoid actually including that in the requirement, because if you make it optional to say this requirement is a firm requirement except for these circumstances, you're actually changing the meaning of it. So you want to keep the requirement itself isolated, I think, from that. And then by adding a comment underneath it, then when they're actually going through, if they decide to use that requirement instead of updating it with one of their own, if in the case of using like a standardized document, then they can just remove that comment, and then that solidifies that this requirement is mandatory as it gets moved on to the next stage. So that's the quick answer to that one. And I will follow it up by email as well to the person who asked that. Did we have anything else, Trevor?
Yeah, we had one. What does QB and QScribe stand for?
Yeah, good question. So in QScribe, it stands for QRA verified requirements, or QScribe is a QRA verified scribe. So it's basically like a requirements expert sitting next to your team as they're going through and writing the requirements, because they're being checked and verified by QRA's standard. So that's a good question. Are there any other questions? You can go to the chat if you do have anything else. We'll keep that open for another moment here. So if you do have questions, you can type them in there right now. I'm going to jump back a couple of slides. So go ahead into your questions if you do have any more. But I'm going to look at that case study that we talked about by Ultra Electronics. So when we first started working with Ultra Electronics, they had a need to reduce the total number of hours that were spent discussing and correcting vague and ambiguous requirements. They wanted to standardize the requirements authoring across large multidisciplinary teams, and they wanted to mitigate potential risks in customer requirements earlier in the bidding process. So they really had this core need of addressing their requirements in a way that made sense across the company. They had people that were in charge of writing their requirements, like that quote that we heard earlier. Once they started using QScribe, and these are their estimates based on people that were actually using the tool, they found an overall efficiency increase, and their unity and quality increased as well, while reducing the time that it took to write and update the requirements by 75%. So just open up your mind to the possibility that maybe the people that are spending the time reviewing these documents are spending a lot of that time not really taking advantage of their expertise or of their knowledge that they have, because it's being spent checking for these tedious, repetitive things that the computer can actually really help you with by automating that process. So it's about clearing their mind and allowing them to focus on the subject matter so that they can catch more of those high-risk errors that can be caused by the wrong information slipping into these requirements. So a couple of quotes from that case study, and there is a link here as well. You can follow that link if you request the slides from me by email. But in terms of risk reduction, they said detecting and correcting requirements errors in the definition phase before they can propagate to later phases of development where they become increasingly costly to fix is the greatest potential savings factor that QScribe offers. And then that quote that we referenced earlier, one of the mechanical engineers working there said, "We have references on good requirements writing, but QScribe is faster." So you can key in your own company information, your own rules and your own standards that you want to include. You can update that over time. And then the feedback that your entire team is getting as they're writing them is actually that information from your requirements experts that you have on your team. So they cited those two things, catching risks early and reducing the amount of time spent as the biggest savings that they had. So if you see an opportunity for this, it is a big decision. There's obviously a lot of moving parts involved. So I would recommend if you follow up with me by email, I'd be happy to make those connections within your company and get the process rolling of evaluating a tool like this and getting it into your hands. So at the individual author level, we'd like to help you save time and reduce the monotony of repeating the way that you review these documents. For managers, we can help your team all get on the same page and really unify that to avoid the conflicts that can come from, you have that one person on the team that's really excited about clear requirements and is always harassing the other people to kind of get them on the same page. If you introduce it as a tool, and you have a set standard that you've agreed to as a company to use, it becomes a lot easier to have those conversations to say, hey, this is actually something that we've already decided. We're going to find another way to say this instead of using that particular word, for example. And at the company level, you have these efficiencies that come from improving these processes, saving time so that you can get more processes through the funnel and reduce the risk overall of these issues coming up. Get back to questions here.
Yeah, I've got a couple more questions.
Okay.
Have you been contacted by any of the standards bodies such as ISO, API, or ASTM?
Yeah, good question. So we have worked with IEEE in the past. So one thing that we're interested in doing going forward is, we have the INCOSE standards there right now within the tool. We're definitely interested in working with some industry partners to develop similar configurations for different standards as well. So the particular rules that these different standards would follow. We have also started working with the regulatory groups. For example, the Government of Canada is now using QScribe for their FORIA initiative, which is the Frontier Offshore Regulatory Renewal Initiative, and they're using it now in the actual process of writing the rules and regulations that need to be followed for offshore projects in Canada. And then also the JIP 33 standardization initiative that we talked about earlier. They're fairly new to it. They're in phase 3 now of that standardization process. They used it a little bit in phase 2, but are actually rolling it out for the first time for themselves in stage 3 right now. So that's currently in evaluation with their group. And are there any others?
I think that's it.
That's it. All right. So like I said, again, my email is at the bottom there. If you would like a copy of this presentation, you'll have a link to all the slides with some screenshots in there as well. And also the opportunity to view and share the recording of this presentation as well. So just shoot me an email, james.carr@qracorp.com, and I'd be happy to make those slides available to you as well. For those of you that attended live, appreciate you taking the time today to join us for this live tutorial. And for those of you viewing online, we still welcome you to reach out by email if you'd like a copy of these other resources that were mentioned. So